All right. So, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are thrilled to have you here and grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedules in the middle of the week to spend this next hour with us. So, today's conversation is grounded in the findings from our new Louisiana Data Landscape Report, which offers a critical look at the current state of criminal justice data collection and transparency across the state of Louisiana. For those who may be new to our work, Measures for Justice is a nonpartisan nonprofit leading a movement to reshape the future of criminal justice. We develop tools that empower communities and the institutions that serve them to make data informed decisions that improve outcomes and build community trust. Since 2011, we've worked alongside courts, prosecutors, law enforcement, and community leaders to illuminate what criminal justice looks like across the country, collaborate on efforts to standardize and improve the quality of justice system data, and build tools, offer services, and conduct research that promotes transparency, accessibility, and accountability. At the core of it all, we believe good data is a catalyst for meaningful change. My name is Catricia Cleveland. I serve as the Assistant Director of Partnership Development here at Measures for Justice, and my pronouns are she, her. A few housekeeping notes. You'll notice you have access to the chat, so we encourage you to engage throughout today's webinar there. We will put a few questions in there. So if there's any time that you have a question, you have a comment, please feel free to use the chat. We have our team members that are ready and excited to engage to answer your questions. As you enter in, you will be muted. So you currently are muted now, so you shouldn't have to worry about that. But once again, please feel free to use the chat, emojis, hand claps, smiling faces, use it all. We're so glad that you're here. And so we'll go ahead and dive in. I'll pass it to my team member, Brian Gunn.
Thanks so much, Catricia. Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Brian Gunn, and I serve as the Senior Impact and Outreach Manager for Measures for Justice. And I'm so excited to see everyone here today. Before we dive into today's discussion about the Louisiana Data Landscape Report, I want us to start off with a quick thought exercise. Imagine you're trying to build a house, but you're not allowed to see the blueprints. How confident would you feel about the foundation? How about the walls holding up the house? That's what it's like when lawmakers, practitioners, and community members don't have access to high quality data about their local criminal justice system. Following a wave of legislative changes in Louisiana, access to trusted, reliable information isn't just important, it is critical. Without it, decisions get made in the dark, and the real impact on communities, it goes unseen. So here's a warm up for everyone. In one word, type into the chat, what does having access to trusted data mean to you? I'll give everyone a few seconds to type in their responses, and we'll read some of them as they come in. What does having access to trusted data mean to you? Accountability. Accountability again. Okay, so I see two people are in sync with accountability. Equity, yes. All right. Conversation. Okay. Yes, absolutely. Keep those comments coming in. Confidence. I like that. Power. Yes. So thank you all so much for sharing that because today's conversation is about exactly that, shedding light, connecting the dots, and making sure the information we need is not just available, but accessible and trusted. So with that, let's get started. I'm excited to introduce my colleagues, Shelby Davis and Isaiah Jefferson, who will facilitate today's discussion. Shelby joined Measures for Justice in 2017 as a member of the data outreach team. During that time, she visited criminal justice agencies throughout the country to collect data at the county and state levels to populate MFJ's national data portal. In her current role as Director of Research and Data Stewardship, she assists with the development of the organization's overall system for measuring local criminal justice performance and lends direction to MFJ's research projects and partnerships. Shelby earned an MA in Criminology and Criminal Justice from the University of Missouri, St. Louis, where she examined a number of topics, including youth-involved gun violence and institutional responses to police use of force. Her work at MFJ is inspired by a commitment to bridge the gap between research and practice, and in particular, to help create systems that are just and equitable for all people. Next up, we have Isaiah Jefferson. Isaiah joined MFJ as a legal research assistant in 2020 after graduating from the University at Albany with a bachelor's in criminal justice. He has been one of two researchers conducting legal contextual research that complements the National Data Portal and Commons measures. Isaiah has also and organized community listening sessions in order to inform MFJ on what was most important to community members on understanding their criminal justice systems. He has also contributed to MFJ's data literacy and community toolkits. Isaiah remains passionate about using his expertise and experience to serve communities. In addition, Isaiah has been involved in other research reports as a co-author and methodologist, including the PL 280 Law and Indian Country Report, and today's focus, the Louisiana Data Landscape Report. And with that, I'd hand it over to Shelby Davis and Isaiah Jefferson to lead us in our further discussion.
Thank you, Brian and Katricia, for those wonderful introductions. Again, as mentioned, I'm Isaiah. I know Shelby and I are super excited to talk to you all about our work we did in Louisiana. We're going to start off today by level setting on what MFJ data landscapes are. Then I will describe our methodology, specifically Louisiana research methodology. And then from there, Shelby will take over to talk about what findings we pulled from our research, which will lead us to a discussion on the recommendations that we are providing about improving criminal justice data collection, usability, and transparency. If anyone has any questions, I know it's been mentioned, but please use the chat, and we would love to talk at the end for some Q&A. So in these data landscape reports, they detail our investigations into the accessibility, transparency, and quality of data that people experience within their state. They can answer a myriad of different questions from like what are the key pathways or barriers to data access within the states, or does the law in the books align with actually what's put into practice, and much more. While our target audience is practitioners and legislators, we wrote these with the intention that anyone, no matter if they are an expert in data or in the legal system, can take away something out of these reports. In addition to unpacking themes around data challenges and opportunities, these reports also include a series of recommendations at the end that I mentioned, and it's for those who are invested in change and to have some starting points to consider. These recommendations are, of course, dependent on what we found in reports. So, for example, in Louisiana, we heard a lot about data collection and the lack of standardization, and you will see that reflected in our recommendations. So in this slide, you will see our completed data landscapes. In 2019, we conducted one with Stanford Law in California, and then 2022, Shelby led one investigating New York's data systems, and of course, now we're just published Louisiana's. As you can probably tell, these have evolved over time. So the California one was referred to as the data gap, somewhat different, but mostly the crux of it is all the same. But we really going to talk about today Louisiana's data methodology as well as the findings from it. Our methodology can be broken down into two main parts, legal research and then the semi-structured interviews that were conducted. Both parts would inform one another. So the legal research would contextualize what we learned from these interviews, And then our participants would explain the real world impacts, implications, and perceptions of these relevant laws and regulations. So our legal research was conducted by our own Nathan Hawk, who I believe is in attendance today. The legal research focused on three main record types, those being court records, criminal history information, and corrections records. It also had a two-phase approach to it as well. In the first initial phase was used to help our interview team, so Shelby and I, get a understanding and foundation of what laws govern data within Louisiana, as well as evaluate our interview questions to make sure that they're relevant. And then the second part was for if anything new was learned from these interviews, or we needed more information around about something, another round of research would be conducted. This was especially helpful when interviewees mentioned specific bills that affected their access to CJ data, and we needed to learn more information about it. As mentioned, they reviewed mostly, a lot of primary sources, secondary sources, so state statutes, legislation. For example, he researched House Bill 767, 768, and of course the Louisiana Public Records Law. But ultimately, there were 22 questions that guided his research. Of those, they were bucketed into four main groups, those groups being legal authorities, statutory definitions, accuracy and completeness, and access and disclosure. Now, for our interview methods, we of course began by developing our sample, and we used various strategies to do so. We used snowball sampling, quota sampling, and purposeful sampling. We were trying to be intentional on who we were inviting to be interviewed. We wanted to get a sample of diverse expertise and try to get folks that could represent all parts of the state and made sure that they had some proximity to data itself. For our Louisiana report, we spoke to 11 individuals. Most were currently holding nonprofit or advocacy roles. One was currently holding a state government position, and a couple others previously held positions in state or local governments. Again, as mentioned, these interviews were semi-structured, and I know there are experts in attendance today as well as those we've interviewed. But for everyone's clarity, this meant that we had a interview protocol and a standard set of questions that we utilized. But because we wanted to really discern what people's perceptions and experiences of this phenomenon of criminal justice data collection, transparency, accessibility, we let interviewees kind of lead a discussion to topics that were most relevant or important to them. And of course, the participants were given the opportunity to remain anonymous. However, we did record the interviews, and transcribe them for our own internal data processes and data analysis. Once the data was collected, we did rounds of familiarization, so rereading the transcripts over and over again to get a really good understanding of it. Then open coding, so us individually annotating those transcripts um, so we can see like the patterns that are starting to emerge. And then also we did some memos to ensure we properly understood the transcripts. We did all this individually. Each person would open code and memo multiple transcripts. Once we were done with initial codes, Shelby and I did multiple rounds of review and consensus until each code was properly defined and each transcript had a finalized coded version of it. And then we made sure that we agreed upon that it felt accurately represented the participant's experience. And then from there, we could do our last phase, which was thematic analysis. So all of us as a team, me, Nate, and Shelby, we separately reviewed the final transcripts and codes to pull what we saw were the overarching findings. And then we met together and deliberated those findings until we agreed on the final themes that emerged from the data. Throughout this research, we used processes such as bracketing from the first point of interview development all the way to this thematic development to ensure that we limited our biases as much as possible. And so here are the four themes that emerged. We have data silos, access barriers, policy driven by limited evidence, and creative collaboration. Shelby will soon take over to discuss those themes in depth, as well as our recommendations for improving criminal justice data within the state. But before I hand it off to Shelby, I want to give a quick pause to see if anyone has any questions on our methodology.
And as we mentioned at the beginning, there will certainly be an opportunity at the end for additional questions. So if you're like me and questions kind of bubble up down the line, you think back to something that was said earlier, make a note or feel free to plug it in into the chat, and we'll definitely get to that. Samantha asks, can you say more about the sampling frame? Isaiah, do you want to take that? Or would you...
Sure. Samantha, can you elaborate on uh, specifically about the sampling? I can say that we, oh, yeah, great question. So we try to get statewide representation as well as like more nonprofit or private representation. We had a list of, I want to say around almost 70 individuals that we reached out to, and these were people that were in positions in DA's offices or in more like statewide, so like the AG's office, and then smaller could be like the data wranglers at a local agency or things like that. So I hope that answers your question. We try to get as many people as possible and broad, and also we were kind of trying to keep track of where in the state we were looking at. Another question. What are you looking for in legal research documents? Mention of data sources citations. I believe Nate is in attendance. I don't know if he can say anything to that. But we're looking for kind of what laws kind of dictate who has the ownership over certain data, what data can be released and how does it get released, um, and kind of getting to the point of if you want to access that data, what are the processes to do that? Are there any barriers to you doing that? And then also kind of getting up to date on the new, uh, legislation that has passed recently that have undone reforms and things like that. Yes, yes, explained it well.
And I will just add to the sampling question because I think it's an important one here. We did run into a lot of challenges with identifying participants. And Isaiah mentioned we reached out to folks and looked at both geographically where they fell. We really wanted to get folks at least representative regionally across the state. We knew we wouldn't capture someone in every parish or every
Mm.
local jurisdiction. But we did look at that as well as areas of expertise across the system. But there were some voids. We would have loved to have talked to more local practitioners. We only had a couple folks that had either currently or previously held roles in local justice administration. So that is certainly something that we would love to expand on in our future data landscape reports, but kind of shows up in some of our themes around the challenges folks are experiencing in Louisiana. Any additional questions? Otherwise, I will move us on and we can start to talk about each of these themes in a little bit more detail.
Those are great questions. Thank you both.
They are. Okay. So our first theme here that we call out in the report has to do with data silos. And what we mean by this, it might be self-explanatory to some folks, but essentially, criminal justice data are housed in individual systems across the state of Louisiana, and there are limited or no connection points. Often, these data are housed within an agency's individual system, and they don't connect with sort of a broader centralized system. And these silos really make it difficult for folks to assess criminal justice practices, both across jurisdictions, parish to parish, but also within a given jurisdiction across agency types. So it prevents us from really getting a holistic look at someone's complete experience with the criminal justice system. And I will say there were a few instances mentioned throughout our interviews of centralization and transparency efforts happening at the local level. In particular, open data portals in Baton Rouge as well as New Orleans were cited as examples of progress. But even given these examples of progress, every participant we spoke with suggested that this lack of centralized data and repositories to sort of access data significantly impedes their work. And so I do want to call out here data silos are a common phenomenon in the state's Measures for Justice has worked in. However, in Louisiana, the people we spoke with often tied these data silos to a lack of trust and this sort of sense of otherness that left folks reluctant to compare their own jurisdiction or their own agency to another. And it was really interesting as we talked through this with folks. It really sort of seemed to be a vicious cycle, if you will, of these data silos prohibiting collaboration and kind of fostering distrust, and then that distrust then serving to maintain the siloed datas and prevent us from chipping away at those. So on each of these slides, I am also going to include a few examples of the codes Isaiah was mentioning. And these codes were sort of a part of our broader thematic analysis and funneled up to sort of inform this theme. So mentions of decentralized data is one. Sense of ownership. So often folks might reference an agency feeling like they own the data, don't need to share it, it's not public information. That was coded as a sense of ownership. And then also this perception of distrust. So either our participants expressed distrust or they expressed that they were perceiving distrust and the impact of that. Following each of our themes, I will also share a few quotes from our interviews that really kind of illustrate what this looked like for folks. And so this first quote is from a participant who worked around clean slate legislation in the state. And as part of their role, they really needed to identify where eligible records existed. And this is them kind of describing that process. The systems won't talk and the process isn't fluid. From when a clerk records a criminal conviction, it goes so many different directions. It may go to the Supreme Court, to the state police, to the DA, and every one of those in this circle keeps a record. So when it comes to expunging that record or clearing the record, there's like 4 or 5 locations. There's no easy central repository. And then the second quote here, I think, speaks to that distrust code. They all have their own little systems and they keep them close to the chest. So again, before I move on to the next theme, I want to pause a few times throughout and give you all a chance to weigh in the chat. I need to go back there and see if folks have been chiming in. But how does this theme sit with you all? We'd love to hear if this resonates, if there are data silos that you experience in your work. Thanks, Brian. I'll give folks a minute to see if you have any questions about this theme of data silos or any comments you'd share. And again, just because I move on doesn't mean the chat closes, so please keep them coming. It's resonating with some folks, it looks like. Great. Well, let's move on to talk then about our second theme that we unpack in the report. And this is one that centers around the ability to access data. So one of the things Isaiah and I started to realize pretty early on is that we weren't able to get deep in the weeds of what data have looked like or what folks have been able to do with data, because more often than not, our conversations sort of centered around this tension of I haven't been able to receive access to the data. How do I even get access in the first place? And so this was true, I think, with folks working with data both collected at the state and the local levels. There were a variety of sort of different access barriers described. I'll say the most commonly described barrier had to deal with agency capacity and agency resourcing. And this was often tied to what folks described as like archaic record keeping processes or just a lack of sufficient technology to provide data. So again, here I provide us a few examples of the codes that were used to inform this theme. As I mentioned, insufficient technology was a big one. We also heard a lot about how the processes around agency data collection and sharing themselves are very opaque. And often folks were left confused about what data exists or whether there was a pathway to access it. And so that's sort of what this opaque processes code speaks to. And finally, the cost. The cost of data access is also something that came up across reports. Sometimes when folks would reference this, it was tied to that resourcing and sort of constraints, and it was going to take someone 50 hours to compile this very basic information in the format required. And here's the breakdown of the price. Other times, though, we had folks reference spending tens of thousands of dollars on reports created by case management system vendors that really didn't seem to take much time to compile, or maybe they'd been provided very quickly in the past. And so it wasn't always immediately clear the rationale behind the cost of data either. And here again, a couple of quotes that sort of capture the sentiment of this theme. This first participant was speaking about efforts to collect data from local law enforcement agencies in the state, and in particular, thinking about how they've run into struggles around historical data. So when you ask for records prior to 2010, they're likely just sitting on a shelf somewhere, and it's very difficult for them. They, police departments, just don't have the capacity to go through those old files individually digitizing for us. And so I would say, on the whole, a lot of the pushback really does come to capacity at some of these agencies. And then a second quote here, I think this person was just really trying to illustrate the scope of the access challenge in their mind. They said it's extremely difficult to obtain any type of information regarding criminal justice here in Louisiana. So again here, I'll pause before moving on to our next theme in case folks have questions about this access barriers theme. I'd love to hear if it resonates, which of these barriers you run into, or if there are others that we don't call out. Yeah, great points in the chat. Robert, keep that thought because we're going to get into some recommendations and we would agree with that. Okay, we'll keep us moving, but please chime in the chat if you have additional question. Okay, our third theme here in ways centers on what folks saw as the biggest implication, or maybe the most significant implication that stems from some of these challenges around decentralized data and around data access barriers. So nearly every person we spoke with expressed concern about what a lack of data or a lack of trusted data, to your point, Robert, mean for policy. And I will say here, there wasn't really one particular policy area that was center stage across our interviews. Folks did speak with us at length, though, about how these various areas of system change, whether that be bail reform and sentencing or post incarceration and reentry practices, how a lack of data prevents us from having a shared understanding of the challenges in those spaces and thus the solutions. There were a few sub themes throughout this, though, that I'll call out. Folks spoke a lot about the justice reinvestment legislation that passed, and then the subsequent rollbacks to that legislation. Again, largely wondering how we could be making these changes without the data to underpin them. Several participants also spoke about concerns regarding the changing or rollback of existing access mechanisms, and in particular, the state's public information law. So those were two sort of sub-themes that emerged. But here are some example codes that, again, were applied to these interviews. This first code, sometimes folks just said this is a bad policy because we don't have data. And so when folks expressed this is a bad or a harmful policy, again, Isaiah and I defined each of these codes to ensure that we were applying them accurately across interviews. That is the code we would use. Um, a lack of data collection and reporting, of course, informs this theme, as well as the idea that media misconceptions are a powerful influencer in Louisiana when we lack concrete criminal justice data. So that came up across several interviews. And again, I want to give us a chance to kind of see what some of that looked like. So thinking about the media misconceptions piece, this first quote really illustrates that this perception that we're using rhetoric and headlines to push our decisions rather than the data. The second quote, thinking about the importance of having data to look at what's happening over time. So this person shared, this year it feels extremely important that we create a baseline so that we can talk about how destructive these policies are because they're not going to make us safer. That's one of the real needs for data transparency moving forward, not just seeing where we are today, but also being able to compare where we were yesterday, where we were at the time these reforms were made. So again, thinking about how quickly things are changing, but how folks don't feel like they have the information to feel confident in those changes. And finally, in the absence of an answer, people make up their own. If we don't allow people to get to an answer utilizing actual data, they're just going to roll with what they have. So again, I'll pause here and check into the chat. I see a lot of engagement happening. I love that. So how does this policy driven by limited evidence resonate with you all? I will ask too, are there particular policy areas that you're thinking of when you think about the need for data? Far too much. All of them. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about this theme before I move us on? Mm, charging youth as adults, even when voters block these measures. Yeah. Going back to that accountability and the importance of accountability that folks were calling out in our icebreaker discussion. Ending parole and limiting good time credit. Yes. Community supervision insights. Well, thank you everyone for chiming in. I'm going to move us forward so we can talk about our final theme that we unpack in the report. Clearly, there's a lot of work to be done around criminal justice data in Louisiana. There's plenty of opportunity for progress. But it was interesting that despite many of our interviews focusing on the challenges and folks were frustrated with some of these challenges, the conversations also really pointed to the power that can come from creative collaboration and persistence. And that's what we really hope to spotlight in this final theme. We spoke with many people, as Isaiah mentioned. We spoke with researchers, policy advocates. We spoke with folks working within the system who shared positive examples of data progress that stems from coming together and being creative around solutions. And importantly, not just a willingness to come together, but to be patient and listen to the challenges that people are experiencing as they collect or make use of data. So some examples here, suggested solution that was applied when folks referenced creative collaboration as a solution to their data challenges generally. Data transparency mechanism was applied when folks suggested that this creative collaboration served as a direct pathway to obtaining data. And then, of course, collaborative data effort, sort of a general code that we applied across interviews when folks would reference working together with different agencies, different organizations, and then further kind of analyzed that code. So a couple more quotes here. If you have a personal connection with somebody, it makes things move a little bit easier. When I see that email, I know exactly what the project is. I can call up a face. I can call up a person who, treated me as a human being and not just a means to an end. So it's really important to establish those relationships in terms of other data. And then the second quote here, we might not have always agreed on everything, but we could continue to have conversations and we can figure out how we could work together. Right. Next, I'll walk us through those sort of recommendations and what now? What do we do with this information? But if there are any questions about this creative collaboration theme, please feel free to throw them in the chat. I would also love to hear if you know of any creative collaborations underway, orgs working together, agencies working together, that you'd like to shout out. Would love to hear those, or any strategies you've employed in your work that have been effective. All right. But where do we go from here? As Isaiah mentioned at the top of this presentation, in addition to sort of painting a picture of like what are the challenges, what are the opportunities around criminal justice data in Louisiana, we also want these reports to provide recommendations for practitioners who are invested in data quality, data transparency, as well as lawmakers who are looking to make progress in this space. So I'm going to talk through these recommendations now. The first recommendation is really around starting where you're at, and is recognizing that every agency, whether that be local agencies, state agencies, they all are on their own data journey. They're all starting at different points. The challenges and opportunities look differently for everyone. So for some agencies, the next step towards transparency might be a really cool interactive data dashboard. They might be ready for that. Other agencies might just be looking to see what they're already doing and how they can kind of grab those low-hanging fruit and make those publicly available. An example called out in the report is working with agencies to identify those pre-created reports they already have to pull and run. Can we make that information publicly available? Or perhaps it's about like looking at data quality and implementing data quality checks so that agencies feel better about the data they collect. But regardless of where an agency sort of falls in this journey, there's something they can do. So we'd encourage folks to just get started. The second theme, or I'm sorry, the second recommendation we put forth is around establishing data collection standards. Isaiah nodded to this at the top of the presentation. I know Robert in the chat was calling out the need for some of this and would love to hear you continue to chat about it if any of this particularly resonates or you have anything to add. You all really are the experts. But this really goes back to the silos, right? It goes back to those access barriers and this experienced reluctance to share and compare. We really suggest that the state consider additional opportunities to mandate and standardize recording and reporting of data, again, to a trusted state level source. And that state level source should then be tasked with making that information publicly available. So I'm excited to hear more from you all. I see some cool initiatives being flagged in the chat. I'm excited to look more into those. Our third recommendation is around fostering and protecting avenues for data transparency. Lawmakers and practitioners should be mindful of the efforts that we learned about to restrict data access, and those efforts that would further hinder our ability to assess the system. We encourage a focus on creating and preserving mechanisms for access, but also recognize that there is a lot of rightful concern around the unauthorized release of some information, namely personal identifiable information, and what the harms of that could entail. And so, importantly, while lawmakers consider avenues for data transparency, we also encourage them to think of safeguards for the protection of individual identifiable information that, again, could be harmful if shared publicly. And finally, this last theme is really around building culture and data connections. And so we spoke to many people throughout this process who named or suggested that there are these data experts working among us within these systems. And they really don't just know data, but they care about it and they're really excited about the power of data. So we're encouraging agencies to identify those data experts. I know Isaiah and I talked to a few of these folks. We almost had a data superheroes code for them because they really are that important. So not just identifying them, but also empowering those people to make connections across jurisdictions, across agency types, with other organizations, and really start chipping away at those data silos and allow folks to lean into that power of creative collaboration. So I will say before we stop talking at you and open it for a Q&A that the themes I described today and that we found in this report are complicated. And there's not like a one and done easy solution. And these aren't intended to be that. But these are, we hope, helpful starting points as folks in Louisiana consider what are the areas we need to focus on in order to bring our criminal justice data to a better place that can really inform our discussions, inform our decisions. So that is what I've got for you. I will go ahead and turn it over to Patricia, who I think will open up a Q&A.
Thank you so much, Shelby and Isaiah. Thank you. Thank you. We will now open it up. I know we have about 15 more minutes or so. And so wanted to give folks the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have. I did link the report in the chat for those who may not have access to it. It is on our MFJ website. So you have that link. Please download the report, look over it with your team. Do some cross collaboration in other jurisdictions with other agencies, other nonprofits, and really dig in. If you do have any questions at this time, please feel free to use the chat. And then if any questions come to mind as you look through the report, print it out. I'm a person that likes to print out things and highlight. So if that works good for you, do that. And you can always email our team with your questions. Okay, I see one here. Oh, I think that's a question for yep, okay. All right. Well, I'm loving the dialogue in the chat. Um, that is really great. And that's what's happening here. The communication, the cross collaboration, let's share dashboards, let's share resources. This is the creative collaboration underway. Well, as thoughts start to come in, please feel free to, like I said, use the chat. You can always email us. But at this point, we don't see any other questions. I did want to just take a moment to sincerely thank our speakers, Shelby and Isaiah. We have the wonderful opportunity to work alongside them. They put a lot of hard work into this report, and so we're really grateful for them. We also want to thank our community, our local, our state, and agency and community-based space partners and academic institutions. This report was informed by the information that you shared. And so we want to sincerely thank you for taking time out to meet with Shelby and Isaiah. It has really been an honor reading the report, hearing your thoughts, your expertise, and we're real excited about a path forward. Well, if I don't see any, thank you all so much for joining us today. We truly are incredibly grateful that you took time out of your day to be a part of this important conversation. We hope today's overview of the Louisiana Data Landscape Report offered meaningful insight into both the challenges and the opportunities ahead when it comes to criminal justice data in the state. As we've discussed, improving data infrastructure and transparency, it's not just a technical fix, it's foundational to building trust and shaping smarter policy and creating a system that truly serves community and encourages safety for all. So this webinar has been recorded, so we will be sure to share this webinar out with you via email and in the All In Network platform. If you are not a member of our All In Network, please join. You can continue those conversations there also. We will also send out not only the webinar, we'll send a link to the landscape report, and we'll also be sending out a brief survey. So you can let us know if this type of webinar was valuable to you. If you would like to dig in a little bit deeper in the report, please reach out to us. Our team would be more than happy to meet with you or your organization to kind of share a little bit more in detail if that's of interest to you. This work is ongoing and we can't do it alone. All right, seeing if there's anything. Okay, more conversations. I love it. I love it. I love it. But we're real excited about the possibility of continuing these types of conversations, the conversations you're seeing in the chat, and partnering with many of you to move this type of work forward in a meaningful way that really benefits the whole of the state of Louisiana. So again, if you'd like to connect, have questions, or interested in partnering or collaborating with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We do have a little bit more time, but I do want to respect folks' time. So if there is nothing else, I see some email exchanges. Awesome. Well, if there is nothing else, on behalf of the MFJ team, thank you again. Please stay in touch with us. And we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day and a wonderful rest of your week. Bye now.